Okay, so today's daf is Mem Zayin 47. We're going to start Mem Vav, 18 lines from the bottom. Now you might say that sounds like a tall order for one day, but we're going to see that actually we can go through it really quickly. It's 18 lines from the bottom on Mem Vav Amud Bet. Basically, yesterday's daf gets into what I like to call Meta Talmud. Meta Talmud is how do you analyze, in other words, the methodology of the Talmud in terms of arriving at conclusions. So the discussion came up regarding rules, what we call Klalei Apsak, rules of making Pesikat Halacha, deciding Halacha. When Rabbi Yehuda argues with let's say Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Yehuda have a machloket, who do we follow? When Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda have a machloket, we follow Rabbi Yehuda. Now there are exceptions to every one of these rules, but the point is that there are Klalei Apsak, there are rules that determine when there's a machloket. We read all the time, Rabbi Akiva, halacha ke Rabbi Akiva mechavero v'lo mechaverav. If Rabbi Akiva argues with one other Tana, we follow Rabbi Akiva. If it's more than one, we don't follow him. So there's lots of rules like this in the Shas, and a bunch of them were laid out on Mem Vav Amud Aleph and a little bit on Amud Bet as well. And then we say 18 lines from the top. Amar Rav Misharshia litneu lahane klalei. Rav Misharshia says these rules are not real. In other words, I don't hold by these rules. All these rules that you've given, no, I say you have to assess each case in and of itself. You can't say, well, since Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to go with him because he's smarter. Oh, and in this one, we're going to go with Rabbi Yosef because he's smarter. You can't do that. You have to evaluate the situation. Sometimes a smart person doesn't come up with the right answer. So you need to evaluate each case and determine what the halacha is, on a case-by-case basis. So, minalei Rav Misharshia, how do we know that, in other words, where does Rav Misharshia get the idea that these rules are not valid, they are not authentic, they're not binding? Maybe you'll say it comes from the following Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon Omer Lamahad Devar Domeh Legimol Hatzerot HaPetuchot Zo Lezo P'tuchot L'Shut HaRabim Ervut Shetayim HaChitzonot Ima Emtza'it Him Muteret Imahen Vehen Mutarot Imah U'Shtayim HaChitzonot Asurot Zo Im Zo. Now what we're going to find is, the reason I call this Meta Gemara is that it's really not going to be that important to understand these cases. That's why you'll see on the next Amud, there's no Tosafot at all. It's all just Rashi, and that's why the daf is so wide on the next page. The Amud is so wide. Because why doesn't Tosafot talk here? Because the subject isn't actually the content. These examples are just being given to illustrate a meta principle. The meta principle is, how do we decide halacha in this case? Now, it happens to be, what is the case here? The case here is something that we mentioned earlier in a couple of tapim ago, about where you have three chatzerot. The one on the right is open to the middle one. The one on the left is open to the middle one. But the right and the left don't share anything in common. Okay, they don't share any direct entrance, and therefore they cannot make an eruv with one another. The right can make an eruv with the middle. The left can make an eruv with the middle, but the right and left cannot be connected to one another because they don't share an entrance. Okay, that was what Rabbi Shimon said. Now that's not really immediately relevant to the discussion here, because the discussion here is V'amar Rav Chama bar Gurya Amar Rav, that Rav Chama bar Gurya said that Rav said halacha ki Rabbi Shimon. The halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. Oman paligle ale Rabbi Yehuda. And who is the interlocutor, as we would say, with Rabbi Shimon here? Who is the one who's his opponent in this argument? It is Rabbi Yehuda. And yet Rav Chama bar Gurya said in the name of Rav that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. B'ha'amrat Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Shimon halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda. Yet one of the rules that you told us was, whenever there's a machlokah between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, who do we follow? We always follow Rabbi Yehuda. Now I can think, even in my own mind, of cases where that's not true. So obviously there are always exceptions to the rule. For instance, in the law in Shabbat, malacha she'enat tzricha legufa, can you drag a chair, or not malacha she'enat tzricha legufa, malacha davar she'eno mitkaven in Shabbat. That's a case where we follow Rabbi Shimon. But anyway, the point is, we see here a contradiction. We see here that we don't follow the rule that the law follows Rabbi Yehuda, because you're saying the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. Ela lav shema mina litneu.
When were these rules established?
In the previous stuff.
Oh, no, but are they established for
they're general rules with some exceptions.
When were they established as general?
The next generation, I guess, of Chachamim. The next generation of rabbis, like the early Amoraim, the first generation of Amoraim. Because the people discussing it, Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan all were like towards the very, very beginning of the Amoraic period, right after the Tanaim. So they were trying to figure out Klalei Apsak to determine if there's a machloket in the Mishnah between two Tanaim. How do I know which one to follow? No, these are not like the principles of derivation from the Torah are totally different. These are
So in addition to the principle of the derivation, we also have rules.
Right, there are rules in terms of when you have a Mishnah and you have an argument between two Tanaim, and they never made an official psak. In other words, the Mishnah never said this is the halacha. It's not clear. It's not just a majority opinion. There are two rabbis arguing with each other, so we don't know which one we should follow. Should we favor Rabbi Yehoshua or should we favor Rabbi Eliezer? How do we know which one? So they had certain rules about which ones to follow. Now Rav Mesharsha is saying that I don't hold by these rules. So the Gemara says maybe the reason why he doesn't hold by these rules is because look, we have a case of Rabbi Yehuda arguing with Rabbi Shimon. The rules say Rabbi Yehuda, but Rav Chama bar Gurya in the name of Rav says no, Rabbi Shimon. So obviously the rules don't apply. So the answer is this is not really a problem because very simply, when we had a clear statement, halacha follows Rabbi Shimon, fine. But whenever we don't have a clear statement, we rely on the rule. Okay? Now, next case, maybe it's the following Mishnah. Ir shel yachid v'naset shel rabim me'arvin et kula, shel rabim v'naset shel yachid en me'arvin et kula, ela im ken oseh chutzala ke'ir hadasha shebiyehuda, sheyesh ba 50 diurin, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Now again, the specifics of this Mishnah are not really that important. In fact, this Mishnah is going to resurface a few dapim from now as the main subject, which is why even Rashi here, even though this Mishnah is extremely difficult to understand what it's talking about without looking ahead, okay, he doesn't explain anything because it's not the actual main subject. The main subject of the sugya is how do we decide halacha? It's a meta halachic sugya. Okay, but just for the sake of putting some context to this, so the machloket here, the issue here is you have a very large city. This very large city has, according to Rashi's interpretation of the Mishnah at least, this city has 600,000 people living in it. And it has a mavoy, it has an alley. This alley connects the chatzerot, the courtyards of the city, with the outside, like any mavoy does. That's what a mavoy does. The chatzerot, the courtyards, spill out into this thoroughfare, this alley. This alley opens to Reshut HaRabim. Now, because there are 600,000 people living in this place, according to Rashi, that means it's basically a Reshut HaRabim. It's an enclosed place. The chatzerot are enclosed. But this mavoy is accessed by and traveled by 600,000 people a day. Because 600,000 people live in this city and they go out this mavoy. And therefore you cannot simply make a shitufei mavoot. You cannot permit people to carry in this mavoy as if it were just a Reshut HaYachid, because look, it's like a Reshut HaRabim. That's what it means, Ir Shel Rabim. It says if it's an Ir Shel Yachid, a smaller city that becomes a large city, so then you can still make an Eruv, because really, biblically speaking, it's still considered enclosed, it's still considered Reshut HaYachid, and it's okay. But rabbinically speaking, okay, because there's such a large population, it really is too much like it would normally be too much like a public domain for us to use these tricks of allowing people to carry. But if it started out as a small city and it just grew, then we can keep the status quo. However, if it was Shel Rabim, and then it became smaller, en ma'arvin et kula, since it started out as such a large city, so it was thought of as a Reshut HaRabim in people's minds. They think that such a large city, even though it might be walled, it's a gigantic city with 1 million people living in it, literally. So how can we look at it as a Reshut HaYachid? So therefore you have to cordon off part of the city that is not considered part of the Eruv. And that symbolically says, okay, you can't just throw an Eruv at everything. You can't just make an Eruv. You can't just take the entire globe and make an Eruv over the entire world. Okay, there has to be a limit. So since there has to be a limit, what we do to remind people that there's a limit is we cordon off part of this city and say, this part of the city is not included in the Eruv. And that way we remind people that there's a limit on how big the Eruv could be, that there's a distinction between public domain and private domain. Okay? Now, he said, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, it has to be like 50 people have to be living in the section that's cordoned off. However, Rabbi Shimon says, even if there are 3 courtyards within the city, now the entire city is enclosed, right? 3 courtyards within the city with 2 people in each, which means to say a total of 6 people is all you really need to be excluded from the Eruv, to remind people symbolically that there's a difference between private and public domain. Now what's the significance of this? Rav Chama bar Gurya. Rav Chama bar Gurya said in the name of Rav, halacha Rabbi Shimon, the law follows Rabbi Shimon. So again, what's the problem? You told me the rule was Rabbi Yehuda. Now you're saying Rabbi Shimon. Oman Paligale Rabbi Yehuda. And who is the argument? Who's the argument with? It's with Rabbi Yehuda. Amrat Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon halachak Rabbi Yehuda. Now according to your rules, the law should follow Rabbi Yehuda here, not Rabbi Shimon. So what do we do? Umay kushya, not really a problem at all. Dil mahacha nami. The same answer we gave before. Echad ditmar itmar, echad laitmar laitmar. Very simply. Generally speaking, we have a rule. We fall back on the rule when we have no other indication. But when there's an indication to the other way, in other words, when we explicitly came to a conclusion that the law follows Rabbi Shimon, we don't care about the rule. It's when we don't have an explicit statement that we care about the rule. So says how the Gemara answers it. Now, again, maybe Rav Misharshia's argument that the rules don't apply is from the following Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer eno oser, Rabbi Yosef Omer nochri oser, Yisrael eno oser, mepnei she'en derech Yisrael lavo b'Shabbat. Rabbi Shimon Omer afilu hiniachai b'tov alach lishbot etzel b'tov b'otah ha'ir, eno oser she'kevar hisiach dato. So what this is talking about is, when you have a chatzer, we learned already that if you have more than one person living in the same chatzer, you have two options. One is that three options really. One is that you participate with the Eruvei Chatzerot, and we all become one big happy family, and we're all able to carry in the chatzer. Number two, you can do bitul reshut. You can say, you know what? I give up my chelek. I give up my portion in the courtyard. It's all yours. Remember, we learned about bitul reshut. That's fine. Number three, if it's a non-Jew can't join in the eruvei chatzerot, obviously, and he also can't do bitul reshut. What can he do? He can rent you his portion. You have to rent it from him. So when you rent it from him, that's how you get out of it. Now, the question being discussed here is, what do we do if a person is not there for Shabbat? Does he still count? Let's say everybody's here, they all make an Eruvei Chatzerot, and they say, hey, Shmuel is not here this Shabbat. He can't join in the Eruvei Chatzerot, so what do we do? He didn't do Bitul Reshut, and he's not here to do Eruvei Chatzerot, so what can we do? So, the first opinion says that Rabbi Meir says, it's no good. Whether he's Jewish or non-Jewish, if he went away and there's nothing we can do now, we can't include him in the Eruvei Chatzerot, and we can't rent his property from him, so we're stuck. We can't carry in the Chatzer. Rabbi Yehuda says, nope, it's no problem. If he's not there, he doesn't affect it. The fact that he lives there normally, that he owns a residence there, doesn't mean anything. If he's away for Shabbat, he doesn't count. Rabbi Yosef says, it depends. If he's a non-Jew, with a non-Jew, it's the ownership that really makes a difference, right? So even if he's not there, listen, maybe he's going to show up. You never know. He's going to show up on Shabbat. He's not Jewish. So he could come out of nowhere and ruin your Shabbat.
What about the government?
So Rabbi Yosef will say, well, we have to rent it from them. It's a whole complicated thing. But let's say Rabbi Yosef will say to you, okay, the non-Jew, true, really it has to do with whether he's present or not. The only thing is, let's say the Jew goes away for Shabbat, he's not coming back. The non-Jew goes away for Shabbat, he could come back. He doesn't have to keep Shabbat. So Rabbi Yossi says, even though the non-Jew went away, we still have to take him into account. The Jew goes away, we don't have to take him into account. And finally, Rabbi Shimon says, even if a person went to stay at a different house, he went to stay at his daughter's house in the same city, eino oser. In other words, he says not only if the Jew goes away for Shabbat completely to another city, even if he's in that city, but he's staying in a different courtyard, we don't have to worry that he's going to want to walk home to his own house on Shabbat. If he's out of the picture for Shabbat, he's out of the picture for Shabbat. He went to stay with someone. So even though the person's nearby, since he's not in his house, he's in a different chatzer, that's enough. We don't have to factor him in for the Shabbat.
Or if it's a Jew that's not Shomer Shabbat who comes back.
That's it. They didn't deal with that back then.
Oh, really? They didn't
they didn't have that. They didn't have that back then. They didn't have people who were officially not Shomer Shabbat. They only had people who, were on the edge, but on the fringe. But they didn't really have people who were like, I'm not Shomer Shabbat. Those people didn't live in the community. They would be considered like a goy. Back then they would just be considered like a goy. It would be like, you don't keep Shabbat, you're not Jewish.
It's specific dogma that somebody goes to his daughter, he's not going to.
He's not going to come back. Because the son, it says he might, because you get in a fight with the daughter-in-law, they'll come back. That's what it says in the Gemara. Right, he will get in a fight. But the daughter, she's always going to be good, because, the daughters are different. Daughters are different, Daughters are different, yeah. Okay, it's definitely true. Rav Chama bar Gorya said, Rav, halachak Rabbi Shimon, the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon, man paligale Rabbi Yehuda. And we see that Rabbi Yehuda is mentioned that Mishnah. And yet we don't follow his position. We follow the position of Rabbi Shimon. And again, didn't you tell me that whenever we have a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, we follow Rabbi Yehuda? This contradicts the rules. So maybe this is where Rav Misharshia got the idea that we reject the rules. Because look, we're not following the rules, are we? Umay kushya, again I'll ask you, what is the deal here? What's the problem? That wherever it's stated that the halacha is explicitly like Rabbi Shimon, we don't need the rules. That's true. But when it's not stated in either way, that's when we rely on the rules. It's not a contradiction to the rule. In fact, as the old saying goes, the exception proves the rule, right? The fact that he had to tell you that the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon means that in other cases it follows Rabbi Yehuda. Now, some of the Mefarshim ask, how many examples of the same argument do you have to bring? Isn't it obvious by now what the answer is? Right? It keeps giving the same answer. Oh, well, whenever it's stated, that's an exception. Okay, so the point is that maybe after a while, the exception becomes the rule. The point is that the Gemara thought, maybe if I show enough exceptions, you're going to concede that the rule doesn't exist. Answer, no, we're still holding on to the rule. We're just recognizing these all as exceptions. Now, Ela mehaditznan, rather maybe it comes from the following Mishnah. V'zeu she'amru he'ani me'arev beraglav. Rabbi Meir omer anu en lanu ela ani. Rabbi Yehuda omer echad ani ve'echad ashir. Lo amru me'arevin bapat ela lakela ashir. Shelo yetzeh v'arev beraglav. So what it says, so there's a machloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. We know that there are two ways one can make an eruv techumin. One way is with bread, that you leave bread in the location that you want to establish as your Shabbat residence, and then you have 2,000 amot from where you left the bread. The other thing you can do that we've learned about is you can go sit there. Biraglav, me'arev biraglav means you go with your body, and you stand there. So Rabbi Meir says, really, that whole thing about using your body, that's only b'di'avad. That's only for the ani, for the poor person. A rich person is not allowed to do that. A poor person, maybe he doesn't have bread to spare. He can't spare the bread to go put at the eruv. But a normal person who has money, he has bread, he has to do it the normal way. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, on the contrary. It's on the contrary. Actually, really, the main eruv is going physically with your body. And they only allowed you to use bread so that they wouldn't put a tircha, so they wouldn't put excessive burden on the rich person that he has to go stand there. So they have polar opposite opinions, okay? Rabbi Meir says the real way to do an eruv is with bread, but they were lenient with the poor person to let him go there with his body and not use bread. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's the opposite. They were that really the main way to do it is with your feet. Right, to go and to say, this is my residence. But, so the rich person doesn't have to do that, they let him use bread. So they have polar opposite interpretations. And, umatnele Rav Chia bar Ashi, lechia bar Rav kamei de Rav. And Rav Chia, the son of Ashi, said to Chia, the son of Rav, in front of Rav, echad ani v'echad ashir. Whether the person is poor or the person is rich, they can do an eruv with their feet. Va'amar le Rav, and Rav said, sayem banami, you should conclude halacha Rabbi Yehuda. Remember, Rav Chia bar Ashi had the worst tutoring gig ever, right? Because he was always tutoring the son of Rav right in front of Rav, and Rav's always correcting him all the time whenever we see this dynamic going on. So he's teaching him the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rav says, hey, tell him halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. So he does whatever he's told, right? So the point is, though, tarte lamali. If it's true that we already have a rule that the halacha will follow Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Meir, which was stated before in the rules that were given on the previous daf, you already told me the halacha should follow Rabbi Yehuda. So why did Rav have to tell him the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda? It's one thing to tell me there's an exception to the rule. It's another thing to restate the rule. That's superfluous. If you have a rule, then you say nothing. By default, the rule applies, correct? So, umay kushya, no problem. What's the difficulty here? Dilma Rav let lehane klale. Maybe it's Rav who's the one who doesn't hold by the rules. Rav doesn't hold by the rules, but Rav Misharshia is saying we don't hold by rules. I reject the idea of rules. Maybe it's just Rav doesn't hold by the rules, but everybody else does. Maybe we can get it from the following Mishnah. Ditnan hayivama lo tahalot velo tityabem ad sheyehula shlosha chodashim v'chein shar kol hanashim lo yinasu v'lo yitarusu ad sheyehula shlosha chodashim echad betulot, echad beulot, echad almanot, echad girushot, echad arusot, v'echad nisuot. If a person goes from a previous state of matrimony to a new one, they have to wait at least 3 months. What's the reason? To make sure they're not pregnant from the previous husband. Okay? Now that means, as it says here, the Yivama. If a woman dies and she had no children with her husband, and then the husband's brother is going to come do Yibum, right? He's going to marry her now, right? Or he's going to do Chalitza, he's going to release her from marrying him. So either thing shouldn't be done until 3 months pass, because if it turns out that she's actually pregnant from her husband that died, so then she doesn't need Chalitza. She doesn't need to be released from the brother. The brother can't marry her. And in fact, if the brother marries her before 3 months and she turns out to be pregnant from the original brother, it's a major prohibition of marrying your brother's wife. Shelo b'mkom yibum. In other words,
no yibum obligation.
Right? If there's no yibum obligation, it's a severe avera. Right? So we don't do that. And similarly, if somebody was married and got divorced, whether they are a virgin or they have or they're not, whether they're widows, divorced, arusot or nisuot. Arusot means that they had kiddushin, because in the old days they would do kiddushin, and then a year later they would do nisuin. They would have the ring. They would do the ring ceremony. They would wait a year, then they would do nisuin. They would do the actual celebration and the actual living together. So it doesn't matter whether the marriage was consummated or not, is the point. If this woman was married to somebody else, she cannot be married to a new person within 3 months. Whether the person died, they were divorced, it doesn't matter. Whether they consummated the marriage or not, it doesn't matter. It's one rule across the board. One marriage ends, there must be a minimum of 3 months in between that and the next marriage. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Nisuot Yitaresu. Rabbi Yehuda says, you know what? If she was married fully, in other words, the marriage was consummated, she can get engaged. Now, their getting engaged is actually marriage, Kiddushin, Yitarsu. Okay, so if she was already married before, then she can do the betrothal, she can do the Kiddushin. Why? Because Kiddushin, they don't have relations. It's just a consecration, like what we do the first stage of a wedding, a Jewish wedding. So that's okay, because there's no problem that you're going to confuse one child with another, because we're still going to wait for 3 months before they live together, which means if she's pregnant now, if it turns out she's pregnant, she knows it's from the previous husband. Okay? And va'arusot yinaseo. And if she was just betrothed before but never consummated her previous marriage, then she can consummate her marriage with the new guy. And chutz me'arusa shebihuda, except for an arusa shebihuda, unless she was an arusa, unless she had betrothal in Yehuda, because in Yehuda, as it says in Masekhet Kiddushin and other places, in Yehuda, in Judea, they allowed a couple who had Kiddushin, even though they didn't have Sheva Brachot yet, they didn't have Nisuin yet, they allowed them to be alone. Okay, now why that is, I don't really know, but it comes up in Shas a few places. They had Yichud, so therefore there was a concern she couldn't get pregnant. So there it was a different story. So even if she was betrothed in Yehuda, we have to be concerned she could be pregnant. And even if she was previously married and now she's going to be betrothed, if she's living in Yehuda, we have to be concerned that she's going to have relations with the new husband. Okay? Now, that's not necessarily the point of the Gemara here. Rabbi Yosei Omer, Rabbi Yosei says, Kol hanashim yitaresu chutz min almanam bnei ha'ibul. That Rabbi Yosei says, you know what? If it's just Kiddushin that's concerned, and they're not going to consummate the marriage, they're not going to live together, then it's no problem. Even within 3 months of the previous marriage, it's no problem. So you have 3 opinions here. You have one opinion that says the rule across the board is no marriage involvement at all for 3 months. Rabbi Yossi says the opposite. He says, you know what? You can do Kiddushin across the board. Except for the case of the Almanah, because she's mourning. If her husband died, she can't. It's not appropriate. But as long as it's only Kiddushin, where we know there's not going to be relations, we're okay. And Rabbi Yehuda says, you know what? It depends. If the previous marriage was consummated, then you can have Kiddushin. Now, if the previous marriage wasn't consecrated, you can even consummate the new marriage, because we're not concerned that she's going to be pregnant from the previous guy. Okay? So you have 3 views. Now, what's the point here? So Amrinan, and we said Rabbi Elazar. It should be Rabbi Elazar lo al Beit Midrasha. Rabbi Elazar one day didn't come to the Beit Midrasha. He didn't come to the Beit Midrash. Ashkachayla Rabbi Asi. He saw Rabbi Asi the Havakaim who was standing around. Amarle, he said to him, "My amor b'Beit Midrasha." He said to him, "What was stated in the Beit Midrash today? I didn't make it." Amarle, he said to him, "Hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan." This is what Rabbi Yochanan said. Halakha Rabbi Yosei, that the halacha follows Rabbi Yosei. Meaning that if you have a woman who was involved in a previous marriage, she got divorced, or the husband died. Okay, actually, in the case of the husband dying is a different story. They got divorced, whatever, it doesn't matter whether the marriage was consummated or not. Now she wants to get remarried. She can do kiddushin. She can accept the ring and be married halachically. She's married in halakha to the point that if somebody else would have relations with her, it's a death penalty offense. Okay, it's not like engagement today. It can't just be broken. She requires a get, but they're not living together. Now, miklal diachida'a paligale. Okay, so what that shows you is that it must be that one person is disagreeing with him. Why? Because that Mishnah said, the first statement in that Mishnah that said, no matter what, if a woman was involved in a previous marriage, she can't get remarried in any form before 3 months. That was stated stam, without any author. And then Rabbi Yossi came in and said, well, it depends. So, and the halakha is following Rabbi Yossi. So we must say, if the first opinion was a majority opinion, like it sounds, because it just sounds like it's a statement coming down from heaven, it doesn't sound like anybody stated it, okay, then it wouldn't follow Rabbi Yossi, because how could Rabbi Yossi knock out the majority of rabbis? It must be an individual opinion as well. Whose individual opinion is it? Let's find out. In V'hatani, we learned in a Braita, Harei shahaita redufa lelech lebeit avia, o shahaita la ka'asim ba'ala, o shahaya ba'ala zaken, o chole, o shahaita hi chola akara zekena ktana va'ilonit, v'shena roya leled, o shahaya ba'ala chavush bebeit ha'asurin, ha'mapeled lachar mitat ba'ala, now, what is this a list of? This is a list of people who can't possibly be pregnant. Let's take a look at what it is. She was living in her father's house for the past few months. Or she had a fight with her husband and left him for the past few months. They were separated, in other words. Or her husband was too old and therefore not able to perform. Or he was too sick to engage in marital relations. Or she was sick. Or she was barren. Or she was too old to have children. Or she was too young to have children. Or she never reached physical maturity, or she took medicine that made her sterile, or her husband was imprisoned, or she had a miscarriage before the death of her husband, after the death of her husband. So we know that she couldn't have gotten pregnant from him again because he died and then she had the miscarriage. So in all these cases, it is literally impossible, physically impossible, that she's pregnant from her first husband, and yet she still has to wait 3 months before getting married again. Now, that's Divrei Rabbi Meir. So now we understand that in our first Mishnah, the one that said across the board there must be a 3-month waiting period was Rabbi Meir. And apparently, usually, Rabbi Yossi matir le'ares v'linaseh miyad, and Rabbi Yossi allowed the woman to get married immediately, because according to Rabbi Yossi, apparently, we go by the practical reality. We know that she's not pregnant from the first guy, no problem. And so then the question is, Lamali v'amrat Rabbi Yosei halacha Rabbi Yosei. You already told me. So in other words, why did Rabbi Yochanan have to say in the Beit Midrash that the law follows Rabbi Yosei? We already said in the rules, the list of rules on the previous daf, that if Rabbi Yosei has an argument with Rabbi Meir, we follow Rabbi Yosei. So why do we need to be told that Rabbi Yosei, that the halacha follows Rabbi Yosei? It should be obvious. Right? Because Rabbi Yossi versus Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi wins. Oh my kushya, what's the problem? The reason why Rabbi Yochanan had to announce that the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi is not because he doesn't hold by the rules. He does. He knows that usually the rules would dictate that Rabbi Yossi knocks out Rabbi Meir. The only thing is, Rav Nachman said in the name of Shmuel an alternative opinion, that while it's true that generally the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi, in Gezerot we follow Rabbi Meir. And here it's a Gezerah. Why is it a gezerah? It's a rabbinic decree, because really, practically speaking, this shouldn't be an issue. It's a gezerah that the rabbis made across the board. So maybe we make exceptions for gezerot. It's not an interpretation of a biblical halacha, but it's a decree the rabbis made of this waiting 3 months as a safeguard. Okay? So he comes to tell you that no, even though according to Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel, we follow Rabbi Meir when he makes gezerot, here we're following Rabbi Yossi anyway. Maybe we learned it from the following Braita. In other words, we're still trying to figure out what is proof that there are no rules in Psak, like Rav Misharshia said. So, it says that you can go to the fair of the non-Jews, you can purchase animals, you can purchase slaves of various sorts, you can purchase houses, fields, vineyards, and you can write, and you can register your purchases in their courts, because if you don't do it, you're going to lose a good sale. Now what's the point here? The point is that they would make these fairs on Avodah Zarah holidays. It's the opposite of today. Today, everything's closed on the idolatrous holidays. Back then, everything was open. And you would go and buy something, and the idolater would be thanking his idol every time, he made another sale. Now apparently they would have really great sales at these fairs. So the Jews didn't want to lose out on it, of course, because some things never change. So so they're allowed not only to go down and purchase from these non-Jews, because they're not doing it to support the idolatry, they're doing it because they don't want to lose the opportunity for a great deal, and they can go to the courts of the non-Jews and register their purchases as well. Now, V'im haya kohen, if it was a kohen, mitameh b'chutz la'aretz, he can even go ladunu la'ar'eri mahen. That let's say the kohen goes and he makes a purchase, and then this purchase is registered in the non-Jewish court outside of Israel, and now the non-Jew comes and he disputes the purchase, he disputes the ownership or the title of the Jew, so he's allowed to leave Israel and go to chutz la'aretz in order to go to court to defend his property. And just like he can go to chutz la'aretz, even though there's an isur d'Rabbanan or there's a gezerah tumah midrabanan, the rabbis decreed tumah on all the lands outside of Israel for a kohen, that they said that we don't know that the non-Jews were so careful about where they buried their dead. So therefore they made a gezerah over all of the diaspora that it's all tamemet. So there's a whole big issue why kohanim are allowed to live outside of Israel today. It's a big discussion. But anyway.
But there's also a prohibition against using a secular court.
Right, but here it's kimatzil miyadan because you're saving, because the non-Jew is not going to go to the Jewish court.
Oh, when
right.
there is a
yeah. So it says, so just like he can go to chutz la'aretz, he can also go into the cemetery. What are you talking about? How can the kohen? We understand that Jews care about getting a good deal, but I mean, for God's sake, how can the kohen go through a cemetery in order to fight for his rights in court, for his property rights? Rather, what it means is he can go through a cemetery, which is d'Rabbanan, the Bet HaParas that we learned about many times. The Bet HaParas is a field, or this could be even in Eretz Yisrael, where there was a field that there's a grave lost in there and it's been plowed, and we're concerned that there might be residue of bone in the field that the kohen might walk over. But since he's allowed to blow air and clear it out as he walks, in other words, he can inspect each step that he takes to make sure that he doesn't touch any remains of any dead bodies. So therefore, he's allowed to pass through it in order to go. So normally, we would tell the kohen not to traverse that route, but if he has to go defend himself in court, he's allowed to. And a kohen is allowed to go to chutz la'aretz in order to find a wife and in order to learn Torah. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, that according to or it should be lo yitama, actually. Rabbi Yehuda says, when is it true that the kohen can leave Israel in order to learn Torah? That's only if he doesn't find somebody that he can learn within Israel. However, Rabbi Yossi Omer, nami yitama, even if the person can find a chavruta in Israel, he still is allowed to leave Israel to learn. Why? She'en min hakol zoche adam lilmod, as it says in Mem Zayin Amud Bet here, as we turn to the next Amud, a very famous line. She'en min hakol zoche adam lilmod. A person is not fortunate enough to learn from everybody, as Rashi says. Yesh rav shemishnato sidura befiv v'shonel talmidav derech ktsara. There are some teachers who are better than others, and there are some teachers that are more suitable for you than others. You might feel that you learn from teacher A better than teacher B, or vice versa, and different people have different opinions. Some people might learn from teacher A better, some people might learn from teacher B better. You have to know yourself.
We learned that a mamzer who knows Torah is at a higher level than a
An Amar, that's right.
With no Torah.
That is true, but here we see that you might think to yourself, oh, Israel is better. It's better to learn in Israel. I got to go learn in Eretz Yisrael. Everybody says, right? They always say, I got to go to Eretz Yisrael to learn. That's true. It's a wonderful thing. But if a teacher who's going to be able to teach you is in Chutz Haaretz and you're going to learn better from the teacher outside of Israel, you got to leave. Now, Rabbi Yossi says, Masekhet Yosef HaKohen. There was a situation with Yosef HaKohen Shalach Etzel Rabbo L'Tzidon L'Lmod Torah, that in fact Yosef HaKohen left and he went to Tzidon. He went outside of Israel in order to learn Torah. Rabbi Yochanan said Halachak Rabbi Yosef, that the law follows Rabbi Yosef. In other words, Rabbi Yosef brought a proof from Yosef HaKohen, who actually did this. He left Israel to follow his teacher outside of Israel, even though he was a Kohen. And Rabbi Yochanan said, this is the halacha. The halacha follows Rabbi Yosef, that one is allowed to leave Israel, even a Kohen is allowed to leave Israel in order to learn Torah, because learning Torah from the right teacher is such a delicate thing. And vilamali. So why do we need to know that the halacha follows Rabbi Yosef? V'ha'amrat Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosef, halacha Rabbi Yosef. Did you not already tell me, according to the official rules of Psikah, that the halacha is always like Rabbi Yosef against Rabbi Yehuda? Is that not correct? So why did you have to tell me it? So what does it seem like? It seems like superfluous. So maybe the rules are not real because look, he had to tell me the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. So obviously he doesn't hold by the rules. Because if he held by the rules, why would he need to tell me? Superfluous. Answer: Amar Abaye itzarich. Nope, it's still necessary because salka datach amina. It's possible to say hanimile b'matnitin that in Mishnayot the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. Because Mishnayot were transmitted with extreme care. The language of the Mishnah was very, very delicately preserved. Aval b'braita, emalo. But a braita like this statement isn't a braita. It's in a tosefta. It's outside of the main corpus of Mishnah. It wasn't as carefully transmitted. It could be that sometimes the names are mixed up. It could be that what sounds like it's Rabbi Yosei is really Rabbi Yehuda, or whatever. It could be that there's some broken telephone going on. So, emalo, you might think because of the possibility of broken telephone that in fact we wouldn't rely on the klalei apsak, kamashmalan. Therefore, we see that he had to tell you the halacha follows Rabbi Yosei, even in this case, even in this baraita, that it's a reliable baraita, and we don't suspect maybe a corruption in the baraita. Now, so now that we've gone through every possible way of disproving the rules, what did Rav Misharshia mean when he said that the rules don't apply? Since we haven't found any good source to show that the rules don't apply. And rather the answer is Al-Hachi Ka'amar. This is what Rav Misharshia meant. Haniklalei lav divrei akol ninhu te'arav leitlei haniklalei. All Rav Misharshia meant was something we discovered in the course of our travels, which is that according to Rav, the rules don't really work. In other words, what he meant was not that the rules are not real. There are rules. We were interpreting that what he meant was the rules are not real, meaning nobody holds by the rules, and it's an illusion. No, it's not an illusion. Really, there are rules of making halachic decision. It's just that Rav doesn't hold by them. And Rav Misharshia was telling us that Rav doesn't subscribe to any rules. He looks at every case on its own merit. But that doesn't mean that there are not some people who do follow the rules in terms of making halachic decisions. And that's how the sugya concludes. Now, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Rav Yehuda said the name of Shmuel, Chatzei Nochri, in Konin Shevita. A non-Jewish person, since he doesn't observe Shabbat, he's not bound by the rules of Tichum. A Jewish person is bound by the rules of Tichum. He can only travel 2,000 damot out of his area of residence. So, what happens to the possessions of a non-Jew? Let's say, for example, a non-Jew brings you something from his house on Shabbat. He drove 50 miles. Okay, so he was outside the Tichum, and he brought you something that was in his house from the beginning of Shabbat. So do we say this item, he brings you an apple. This item at the beginning of Shabbat was outside the Tichum. Now it's right here. Are you allowed to move it? Do we say that it established its Shabbat residence outside the Tichum, 50 miles away? And so it's outside of its tichum.
The object on itself.
The object, because in other words, the person doesn't have requirements of Shabbat. So what do we do with the object? Do we look at the object in and of itself, by itself, and say no, an object has its own identity? Or do we say that no, it goes by the owner, and since the owner is not subject to laws of Shabbat, neither is the item. No, we did hefker items. We did items that have no owner. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to ask Leman. According to whom are you asking? Okay. Or I should say, according to whom is this statement being made? If it's according to the rabbis. Pshita, hashta, chayvtzei hefker delet lehu ba'alim, ein konin shevita, chayvtzei anochrid, lehu ba'alim, mibaya. We said already in a couple of dapim ago that if you have ownerless items, they do not have a status of tichum. Right? They're not konim shevita. They don't establish a Shabbat residence because they're ownerless. Only a person can establish a Shabbat residence. So too, for a non-Jewish person, since he doesn't establish a Shabbat residence because he doesn't have to keep Shabbat, the laws of Shabbat are not applicable to him, so too his items will be impervious to Tichum. In other words, there's no rule of Tichum attached to them. Because if an ownerless item is that way, because in other words, the whole concept of saying an ownerless item doesn't have a Tichum is that we always go by the person. When there's no person in the picture, the item by itself doesn't have a Tichum. And when the person who is in the picture is not Jewish, so therefore he doesn't observe Shabbat, so therefore there's also no Tichum. So therefore, what must we be going like? Ella, rather, what are we talking about here? Okay, so Ela aliba de Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, v'kamash malan, Emar dam Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri konin shvita, hanemi lecheftzei hefker, de'idhu ba'alim, aval cheftzei anochri, de'idhu ba'alim, lo. That rather we must be going like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Remember in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was the one who said that an object, wherever it may be, automatically gets a techum. So if an object is sitting out in the desert, okay, it's allowed to be moved 2,000 amot in any direction. The object has its own techum. Okay, the object has its own techum.
What can be an object?
I don't know, somebody left a basketball out in the middle of the forest.
Is it ownerless? This is back in the case.
Ownerless, right. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said an ownerless object. The Chachamim said no, it goes by the owner. If there's no owner, it doesn't have a techum. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, no. It goes by the object itself. So that's when it's hefker. That's when it's hefker. That's when somebody abandoned it there. They left it there. Okay? But when it's not hefker, when it's owned by somebody, like a person who's not Jewish, so then it doesn't even have a techum at all. Because why does it have a techum when it's independent, when it's by itself? It doesn't have any owner to determine its techum. But when it has an owner to determine its techum, and that owner is not a Shabbat observer, so then it's fine. So then it has no techum.
It's okay.
Right, it would be okay. That must be what it means. Because according to the Chachamim, obviously according to the Chachamim, if they say that something which is which is ownerless isn't going to have a techum, and anyone who picks it up can establish its techum. So certainly something that's owned by someone who doesn't observe Shabbat, meaning owned by someone who's not subject to the laws of Shabbat, is not going to have a techum limit on where it can be taken. However, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who says that an ownerless object does have automatically a techum, there Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, came along to say that's true for an ownerless object. But if it's owned by a non-Jew, it also doesn't have a techum. It doesn't have a limit on where it can travel. There is an objection. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer Hashoel Kelim min Anochri b'Yom Tov. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says somebody who borrows an item from a non-Jew on Yom Tov, and similarly, if he lends something to the non-Jew before Yom Tov and he gets it back on Yom Tov, and vessels and storehouses that are within the Techum, these items have 2,000 amot to every direction, meaning wherever they were at the beginning of Yom Tov, that is their Techum for the entire Shabbat, 2,000 amot in every direction. Let's say a non-Jew lived outside the Techum. He lived 5,000 amot away, and he brings on Yom Tov fruit. You can't move them. Why not? Because they've been brought outside their Techum. Now wait a second here. Brought outside their Techum, you just told me that if something's owned by a non-Jew, it has no Techum because the non-Jew himself is not bound by the rules of Techum.
Wasn't this borrowed stuff though?
No, at the end it's just talking about his own stuff. Right? But you told me that everyone agrees, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim all agree, that if a non-Jew owns the item, it doesn't have a Techum. Only if it's ownerless, that's where they have an argument that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says it has a 2,000 amat Techum, and the Chachamim say no.
When you say that you don't have the Techum, it's within the Techum 2,000 Amma, but it doesn't abide by it, or is it outside of the Techum?
What it means is at the beginning of Shabbat, it was at a certain place, or at the beginning of Yom Tov, it was a certain place.
Yeah.
Do we assign to every object in the world a location for Shabbat or for Yom Tov? And therefore, imagine a universal GPS that assigns to every object in the world a location on Yom Tov, whether that object is owned by someone or whether it's abandoned somewhere. Okay? Now, does that object, from our perspective, have a limit on how far it can travel on Yom Tov? Which means if a non-Jew goes and takes that object and carries it 100 miles, is it outside of its Techum? Because at the beginning of Shabbat, that item was at point X. Now it's 1,000 amot. Now it's 5,000 amot away from where it was at the beginning of Shabbat. Right. Now, according to the rabbis, we only assign a Shabbat place, so to speak, to an item that's owned by a Jew. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, we assign a Shabbat place to an item that's owned by a Jew and to an ownerless item, because the ownerless item could be taken by the Jew. Okay? But according to the way we're learning up till now, something owned by a non-Jew is not assigned a Shabbat place, because why should it be? The non-Jew is not subject to the laws of Shabbat. And yet we see in this Braita that the non-Jew owned something and it was in his house before Shabbat. And he brought it from outside the Techum, he brought it to you, and now you can't move it because it was brought outside of its Techum. What Techum? It shouldn't have a Shabbat place that's assigned to it that it can't move beyond, because it was in the possession of the non-Jew. So what do you see? So, Amrat Bishlama Kasav Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Cheftzei Nochri Konin Shevita Hamani Rabbi Yochanan ben Nurihi Ela Amrat Kasav Rabbi Yochanan Cheftzei Nochri En Konin Shevita Hamani Lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri V'lo Rabbanan. Because the way that we learned up till now is that nobody holds that an object owned by a non-Jew is assigned a Shabbat location. Okay? Only things that are according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that are hefker, that are ownerless, are assigned a place, a position. Or if they're owned by the Jew, then they're assigned a position. But so according to that, if we had gone the other way and said that no, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that every object in the world is assigned a position, whether it's owned by a non-Jew or it's ownerless or it's owned by a Jew, then we could make sense out of this Baraita, because it's saying that the thing that was owned by the non-Jew before Yom Tov has a limit how far it can go from the perspective of the Jew. But if you're going to tell me that everybody agrees that something owned by a non-Jew does not have a place assigned to it on Erev Yom Tov, then who could be the author of this Baraita? Nobody. Because you're telling me that there's nobody who holds that something owned by a non-Jew is assigned a Shabbat spot, a Shabbat place, a Shabbat position. So the Gemara says, therefore, what must we conclude? So le'olam kasav Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri chaftzei anochri konin shevita. Therefore, we must conclude that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri does hold that not just ownerless objects, but every object in the world, no matter who owns it, is assigned a position on Shabbat. Now, for the non-Jew, it doesn't matter whether it moves out of its position on Shabbat or not. But for the Jew, it matters, because if it comes into his domain, he's going to be limited in whether he can use it. Now, Ushmuel de Amar Kirabanan. So then the question becomes, when Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that the object owned by a non-Jew establish a place, Ukidika Amrat le Rabbanan Pshita, and you had said that that they don't establish a place. So who can that be according to? Only according to the rabbis, right? Because now we're saying that there's really a machloket here. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri holds that things owned by a non-Jew have a place. Shmuel came along and said they don't have a place. He must be following the rabbis, not Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So mahu dite. But you told me that dika amrat le Rabbanan pshita. You said that it can't be that Shmuel was speaking about the rabbi's position, because it should be obvious. If the rabbis hold that an ownerless thing doesn't have a position for Shabbat, is not assigned a position for Shabbat, so why should something owned by a non-Jew be assigned a position for Shabbat? No, it still is, because the answer is Shmuel had to tell you it. Not according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, every object in the world on God's GPS is assigned a position at the beginning of Shabbat or Yom Tov. And that is its place. And it has 2,000 amot techum that it can traverse. Now, for the non-Jew it doesn't matter, but for the Jew, if that object has left its place that it had at the beginning of Shabbat, even if it was in the possession of a non-Jew, it's outside of its techum, from the perspective of the Jew. The rabbis say, no, something owned by a non-Jew is impervious to techum. It doesn't have techum. So why did Shmuel have to tell us that? Since an ownerless object doesn't have techum, why would we think an owned object would have a techum? The answer is because you might confuse an object owned by a non-Jew with an object owned by a Jew. So true ownerless objects don't have a techum. So if you find an ownerless object in the middle of the desert on Yom Tov, you can take it. And it doesn't matter what its techum was. It goes by your techum now. So in other words, if you made an eruvei techumin, you can keep walking with it, for example. But something that was owned by a non-Jew will have you might have thought it would have a Shabbat limit because you might confuse it with something owned by a Jew. And we know that if something's owned by a Jew, it follows that Jew's techum. So even if you made an eruvei techumin to extend your boundary, but your friend didn't, you can't take his stuff past where you're allowed to go. In other words, anywhere he's not allowed to go, his objects are not allowed to go.
And an ownerless object might...
An ownerless object...
lost by a Jew?
An ownerless object is ownerless. Okay. So if you find it, it goes by your techum, according to the rabbis. Yeah. But if somebody else owns something, it goes by their techum. And you might have thought that would apply even to a non-Jewish owned item, so people wouldn't get confused. That's why Shmuel has to say, no, it only applies to a Jewish owned item. That it's limited by the techum of its owner. because a non-Jew doesn't have a Techum. He doesn't have the halachot of Techumin. Now, Rav Chia bar Avin amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Chia bar Avin said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Chaftei nochri konin shevita. I disagree with Shmuel. I say that the objects owned by a non-Jew do establish a Shabbat place. Because if we start allowing objects that are owned by non-Jews to be impervious to Techum, maybe you'll also think that as long as you can walk a certain distance, you can take Bob's stuff and walk with it a certain distance. And that's not true, because Bob is Jewish. And you're taking his stuff outside of his Techum. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, every object in the world is good. And we're not talking about Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. We're talking about the later Rabbi Yochanan. He's saying everybody in the world, every object in the world, no matter who owns it or whether it's is going to be have a Techum assigned to it.
Because you might
mistakenly confuse a Jews thing. In other words, if I made an Eruvin Techumin and you didn't, so I'm able to go 2,000 amot further than you are, and you say, hey, can you take my talit with you? I can't. I can't, because it's you're not allowed to go that far. It's not allowed to go that far. What if my friend who's not Jewish says, here, take this with you? So he's allowed to go wherever he wants. So why should his object have a limit? Why can't I take it as far as I want to take it then? The answer is no. Since the object was here, and he didn't obviously make an Eruvin Techumin because he's not Jewish, it has to be restricted as if it were a Jewish object.
Just to be sure
that I don't confuse it with your object.
So the ownerless basketball in the desert that's what I was getting at before.
The ownerless basketball
might have been owned by a Jew.
But we don't care about that. It's ownerless now. According to the rabbis, we don't care about that. Ownerless, whoever picks it up, their Techum is the one that's going to establish. If it's an ownerless object, you can establish the Techum of it by picking it up. You take it, now it's yours. Okay, and therefore, if you had an Eruvin Techumin, you can go with it past the boundary. There were certain, they used to bring elim, they used to bring animals for sale to this place called Mivrachata. The people in Mechuzah would go to Mivrachata, which they would make an Eruvin Techumin to go there. And they would be able to purchase these animals on Yom Tov. How did they purchase them? On their tab, basically. They would take them and they would pay later. Okay, but they were allowed to.
When on Yom Tov?
On Yom Tov. Amar le Ravina la Rava. Ravina said to Rava, "My datech. What is your reasoning?" The Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Chaftei nochrin konin shevita. VaShmuel Rabbi Yochanan halacha Rabbi Yochanan. VaAmar Rav Chia bar Ravin Amar Rabbi Yochanan Chaftei nochri konin shevita. Gezerah ba'alim de nochri atu ba'alim de Yisrael. There's a problem here. You are assuming now non-Jews brought these animals to Mivrachata, but at the beginning of Yom Tov they were outside the Techum. Non-Jews brought them to Mivrachata, now they're within our Techum. But when you go take them, you're now going to bring them to Mechuzah, you're bringing them outside of their Techum for sure. So you might be holding like Shmuel, who says that since these animals were owned by non-Jews at the beginning of Yom Tov, we don't care about where they were at the beginning of Yom Tov. But Rabbi Yochanan, usually when there's an argument between Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, we follow Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan said that object owned by a non-Jew at the beginning of Shabbat and Yom Tov, their Techum is established by their location at the beginning of Shabbat and Yom Tov. And therefore, since these non-Jews lived far away, and then they come to Mivrachata on Yom Tov, those animals were outside the Techum of Mivrachata at the beginning of Yom Tov. They have exited their Techum. How can we now take them and bring them back to Mechuzah? We shouldn't be able to. So he answered, so what happened was, Hadar Amar Rava, Rava changed his mind. Liz dabnu livnei Mivrachata dekula Mivrachata lididu kedalid amot damya. That Rava changed his mind. He said, you know what? We cannot buy those animals. Why not? Because we're going to go to Mivrachata and we're going to take those animals, and those animals are outside of their Techum, even though they were owned by non-Jews at the beginning of Shabbat, or Yom Tov rather, they're outside their Techum, and we're going to now bring them back to our city. That we're not allowed to do. But the people of Mivrachata itself are allowed to buy them. Why? Because the non-Jews brought them into the walls of that city. Within the walls of that city is considered Daled Amot. Inside the enclosure of Mivrachata is all one place. So it's true, the animal left its Techum, but it's inside the enclosed city. So anyone who lives inside that city is allowed now to utilize those things that came from outside the Techum, because it's not considered moving them any further to move them around the city. because it's within the enclosure. But to take them from that city to Mechozah, where you have to leave the city and now transport them again to a new city, that you're not allowed to do. So, and that's actually the halacha that's in the Shulchan Aruch. It's brought down is like this: that if non-Jews bring to a certain city wares, and they'll let you buy it on credit, basically, they'll let you take it on credit and pay later. They brought it from outside the Techum. If you live in that city and it's an enclosed city, no problem. Because taking it is not really considered transporting it to a new place. And it was already brought outside the Techum, so whatever. But you can't now take that with you outside the city and go somewhere else. Because now you're transporting it outside its Techum even further. And that's the bottom line. That's the halacha.